So we have the president, Abdulaziz Bouteflika, who says, I won't be running, but it seems that the system he's created is still very much intact.
Yeah, it's intact. Basically, the men who have been part of power, you might have a slight change of caste, a new, new interior minister, foreign minister, overseeing the country and this transition. But the fact is, the people who have been in power, essentially what's called the system there, remain in power. And this is why there are so many doubts that were raised, literally within hours of his announcement in the past few days on the street that they were had, that the people were essentially had, that, yeah, he's bowing out, but nothing's essentially going to change. And what's interesting is there's even a sense, perhaps, that they're trying to find a compromise type of figure, someone who could perhaps placate the protesters on the street, be accepted by them, if not embraced by them, and yet someone that the powers that be, the regime, also feels comfortable with. And it's significant that a man like Lakhdar Brahimi is going to be heading up this the national conference, the conference which is basically designated to discuss Algeria's future reforms, both political and economic reforms, paving the way for a new constitution, paving the way and also fixing the date for eventual new elections. So this is a man who's a seasoned diplomat, was the Arab League and UN envoy to Syria in the past. He was also, back in the early 90s, before Bouteflika was in power, was a former foreign minister of Algeria. But a man who's basically seen as very much straddling the divide between, a man of the streets, respected by Algerians on the whole, but yet at the same time, who perhaps is the powers that be feel comfortable with. So it's sort of having your cake and eating it too. And they're trying to, you can almost see this effort to try to find a compromise figure to allow them to cling to power, to allow them to at least oversee this transition, them being the system, them being the Bouteflika people, and being able to tip the scales, so to speak, throughout this period leading up to eventual elections.
Now, because we do have Algeria's deputy prime minister who's been speaking to a radio station, I believe, and he said he's ready for dialogue with the opposition. But Doug, I want to ask you, because on Friday we could have another mass demonstration take place.
Up to 10 million, yeah.
Exactly, up to 10 million expected to take to the streets. It's been 4 weeks now. What have Algeria's neighbors been saying about all this political unrest in the country?
Well, one prominent neighbor has been talking, hasn't actually mentioned Algeria by name, but it doesn't take too much reading between the lines to know that El-Sisi in Egypt, remember, a man who came to power through a sort of counter-revolutionary military uprising that overthrew his Islamist predecessor, Mohamed Morsi. You remember that in 2013. This is a man who has made his sort of mark by banning protests, by jailing Islamists, by cracking down on dissent, cracking down on journalists, not exactly making his mark as someone, at least as seen from the West, as a democratic figure. And what he's basically been saying is that these protesters are ruining their country, that it's dangerous for these people to be protesting. He was actually quoted as saying, how are tourism or factories or trade supposed to get off the ground? Should we eat, or should we say that we were busy protesting? So it's a real denunciation of the protesters, and he's been highly critical of the Arab Spring uprisings, the so-called Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 that overthrew Hosni Mubarak and ultimately led the way for him to come to power, although there was Mohamed Morsi in between there. But he's been very critical of protests, so it's interesting that Egypt has spoken out. There will be the question, people are wondering, we've been saying this is a belated Arab Spring for Algeria. A lot of people don't like the term Arab Spring. They say it's
a
really not accurate.
They've been calling it.
Exactly, or an uprising, a revolution of sense. But what's interesting is, will Algeria follow sort of a democratic path, such as Tunisia followed, a path to democracy, and it was an outlier in the region? Will it take sort of that military strongman approach, cracking down on dissent, as in Egypt? Will it lead, heaven forbid, you might say, to awful wars and factional conflict, as in Libya or in Yemen?
But, for the most part, these protests have been peaceful. I mean, they have been peaceful for nearly a month
Absolutely.
now.
No, I'm not talking about the protests themselves.
Exactly.
It's not the protests.
What it will lead
it's the
to.
response to the
Indeed.
protests that people could be worried about. And we have had the Army General basically reiterating today. He's been speaking a lot, General Salah, in recent days. He reiterated what he said before, that under all circumstances, the Army is going to ensure the security of the country. And you could read into that what you will, but it doesn't take a lot to read into it that a lot of the protesters are going to hear those words, and they are going to see a not so thinly veiled threat.
Now, I want to talk about Algeria because it's an energy-rich country. Have these protests, disrupted the energy sector?
Well, there are workers at the big gas company that have been basically striking. Yeah, you're right. I mean, oil revenues, 95% of the export revenues. It's a giant sector in Algeria. It doesn't have a massive diversified economy. So yes, there's the potential for real disruption in the energy sector. There's disruption that's going to worry a lot of investors looking in because Algeria is, I think, the third largest producer in Africa, but it has been billions, if not tens of billions, you could check the figures here, of reserves and even undiscovered reserves. And there's a lot of multinational companies which would like to get into Algeria, would like to help explore. They need the expertise, the technical know-how to help get to that oil and those hydrocarbons to get at it. And any sort of event of this kind that disrupts that energy sector is obviously, you could say, also going to be a pull on Algeria's economy. So the less time there is, that there will be some sort of peaceful transition and perhaps a new figure in Algeria, and that things will become clearer for its economy and the path forward, perhaps the more the comfort level will rise of outside investors and also people inside the company helping to really tap into Algeria's full potential when it comes to its energy sector.
Indeed, Doug. Thank you very